Hey everybody, I'm back with you in this second in a video series on Power Apps Component Libraries Enhanced Properties. Today we're going to talk specifically about function properties. So excited, let's talk more about it. My name is David Warner. I'm Microsoft MVP, Microsoft Certified Trainer, work for Quizzitive, do a lot in the community. Would love to collaborate with you. Reach out if you have any questions. Love interacting with the community. Appreciate everything that you all do. Thanks so much. All right, so what's our agenda for today? Well, we're going to have another review of component libraries because if this is the first time you found any of these videos, maybe you didn't watch the first, it's good to understand exactly what they are. And then we're going to get into what the details of the function property are. I covered it in the first, but we'll cover it again here. We'll set the stage for our function property demo, and then we'll talk a little bit more about action and event properties. So what's a component library? Well, again, components and component libraries are a way to create reusable features and functionality that you can use one across your app. So if you're doing something like maybe a header that is on every single screen, you could create a component out of it. And you could do that within the app itself. But when you do that within the app itself, it only lives in the app. But a component library allows you to be importing that functionality or that UI experience into multiple apps, and you still maintain one solid truth, right? So you go change the component in the component library, and all the apps that are importing it get an update to whatever it is you changed, and that way, if you need to change it in multiple places, then you've got that covered. It's handled for you by the architecture. So it works as a centralized repository, super, super cool, provides consistency and ease of maintenance and stuff like that. Really cool. So today we're going to dive into function properties. And again, just what are function properties in the new enhanced property ecosystem? They are basic input-output functions that allow you to do some basic logic. So you're going to be able to do calculations, and they do have optional parameters. So we'll see that as part of the demo. But they're not going to give you access to things like variables or data flow. They're not going to give you access to behavioral things like onSelect or resets or anything like that. It is just for basic logic that can be passed in and out, but they can still be pretty useful, and we'll see an example of that. So again, what can they do, what they cannot do? So they can perform basic calculations, right, inside of a component. You can generate dynamic values for formatting and mapping, for example, computing, etc. And they can return a computer result based on input properties. So they can work together, much like we saw those basic input properties, right? But they are functions. They can't trigger actions or side effects, right? So we'll see how we can use action and events properties for that. And they're accessing variables or collections outside the component. Can't really do that either. All right. So what is the demo that we're going to do? What's our use case? We're going to stick with our badges like we saw in the first demo. Now, if you didn't get to watch that video, essentially there are badges that are part of a community recognition program where when you contribute to the community, you can earn badges for a variety of things that you contribute. So we're going to set up a component that has a click to share function. So it's going to have 3 buttons for sharing your badge with Twitter or X, LinkedIn, or Blue Sky, and we're going to pass that into the function property. And then the output, or that'll be the output. Now the output will generically or dynamically generate the correct link based on what it is that you're clicking on, the button you're clicking on. And then the input, we're going to actually disable one or more of the shareable buttons. So we'll see how they can work together. They don't have to work together. Again, they can work together. They can work independently. So we'll see an example of how all that works. All right, let's jump in the demo. All right, so here we are in Power Apps Studio, and let me start out by setting some context. I've created a component. It's called Function Properties. It's got some buttons and our badge. And what we've done is I've set up each of these buttons to essentially simulate on our onSelect the creation of a click to post for the social purpose, right? So I want to share on one of these social networks that I earn this badge, and you can kind of click this this intent URL for Twitter, for example. We've got one for LinkedIn as well. And what these do is they just kind of start out a share, pre-populates it with the URL of our badge, right? So I have that for X and LinkedIn and Blue Sky. And that's all there is to it. So now when I come over to my screen, I've got the screen here. I've added my component. So I could have done it here. I've got function properties. I've just added it right here and renamed it. And now when I put this into preview, I can click each of these and I get the notification up here, right? So I'm just using the notify method to simulate the fact that I would actually instantiate that URL or something like it, right? So those work great. Okay, wonderful. Now, what if I wanted to take advantage of that ability to share my badge somewhere else, but I want to do it in my app? Right? That is where the function output property can come into play. So I could create a function output property that allows me to get access to that URL. So we'll do one just simply for LinkedIn. All right, so I'm going to create a new custom property. I'm inside of my function here. I'm on the components. I'm in my components and I'm on my function properties component. And I'm going to create a new custom property. And for that, I'm going to click function and then I'm going to select output. And I'm going to leave it as text for now. And I'm going to call it function output li social URL. Okay, so I'm going to click create. So that creates that function. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the value of that function by just simply clicking on the function name there. And what it has now is it just has simply text, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace that text with that share URL, right? With that share URL. So now that is what's going to be supplied to my app when I execute the function for this output function. So how do we set that up within and test it within our app? Well, I'm going to come over to my screens and you'll notice that I've got an app button down here. And the on select for it right now, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't really do anything at all. But what I can do is I can reference my component, my function properties component right there in the on select. And so I could say notify, and then I'm going to say function props. So it gives me that as a choice right there. I can access that. So I'm going to go back, function props dot, and now I can access my function, my output function right there. And what's going to happen is I'm going to do that. I'm going to close off the function because you need to do those open paren, close paren. And now I'm going to close this off completely. Now, inside my app, what's happening is I've tied the on select to that output function of my component. So what effectively happens is whatever is inside of my component right here. So I went back to my component. I'm on my component. I'm looking at the output property of that output function property. Whatever is here is going to be provided to my calling of that function. So now when I put this into preview and I click app button, we see I get that. That's what's happening is I'm invoking that function. And what I get is I get that URL being returned to me, and then I'm displaying it in the notify. Now, I didn't click on any of these buttons. I didn't click on any of these, right? I just simply clicked on my app button. This app button exists here inside of my app, but I'm still able to leverage some degree of sharing within that's coming from my component, right? So from within my component, I can expose the ability to access the LinkedIn share URL somewhere else in my app. So that's all well and good, but effectively for me to take advantage of doing the other buttons here, I would have to create a separate output property for each one of X or Twitter and Blue Sky, and I've already got LinkedIn. Is it possible for me to make it a little bit more dynamic? Could I make the output function a little bit more dynamic? Yes. Remember, there are parameters that are available to us as part of the function properties. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call it func output social URL dynamic. So now instead of being associated to just one social platform, it's dynamic. I'm going to choose property or data type as function. I'm going to choose output. And then I'm also going to create a parameter here. I'm going to call it social platform. So essentially what I'm going to do is this parameter is going to accept a text value. And the parameter is going to be called social platform. Let me spell it right. There we go. Social platform. So now from within my app, when I call this output function, I can actually pass a parameter, and then the output function can do something with that parameter. So I'm going to click create, and I'm going to click create, and now I've got 2 here. And so if I come over and drop down, we see both of them are here, right? So I'm able to access it. So I can set the default value for my social platform if I wanted to, and I'm not going to do that now, but I could. But more specifically, I want to define exactly how the functionality is handled. So I'm going to go to my, I'm going to pull this out a little bit more. I'm going to go to my dynamic, and right now it's just returning text. But what I want to do is I want to set up an if statement. And what the concept is that when I add this in, the concept is that if social platform, now social platform is that parameter I created. I can access social platform from within the formula editor for this output property only. If I tried to access social platform somewhere else, it wouldn't really work, but I can access it from within here. And I'm essentially saying if it's LinkedIn, then send back this URL. If it's X, send back this URL. If it's Blue Sky, send back this URL. And where I provide this value, this social platform value, is within my app, right? Okay, so again, I've got this output parameter here, and I'm going to take advantage of that, right, within my app. And I'm going to pass in which of these that I want it to return to me within the app. So when I come back over to the screen on the app, I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to adjust this now, and I'm going to change it to say, instead of just simply calling that simple one, I'm going to say notify function props component dynamic, and now I'm passing in that parameter, right? So effectively, when I click on this app button now, I should be able to see the share URL for Twitter or X. So if I do that and test it, click app button, there we go, right? I see that that is for that. Now, if I were to escape out of this and I come in and I change this value to linked in, and I put it back into preview, I click the app button again. Now I'm getting the LinkedIn click to share URL. And of course, I could use this URL to do something with it if I wanted to. But again, we're just illustrating that the exchange of data between the app and the component. So that's pretty cool, right? So I don't have to have a separate, if I go back to the component and look at the properties, I don't have to have a separate one for each platform. I can make this dynamic. Now, of course, this if statement is very simple. It's not robust or complex or elegant. It is very simple, but it illustrates the point. It illustrates the point that we could create an output function that does something that we can call from within the app, and then the component handles it via this logic and passes something back to our app, right? So it's a really good illustration of how we can utilize output properties. Okay, so that handles output properties. But what about input properties? And as a reminder, input properties allow the app to identify and determine the logic that happens, and then the component will take into account that logic, right? So how can we take advantage of that? Well, let's take an example. Let's say that we want to allow the app to disable the clicking of one of these buttons. Maybe, for example, an organizational, rule is that we can only use LinkedIn or Blue Sky or X or something like that, one or the other, right? So how could we take advantage of allowing the app to determine whether or not any of these 3 buttons within our component is actually going to be disabled? Well, again, we can use an input function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new custom property, and I'm going to say function, and I'm going to leave it as input. And we're just going to focus on X or Twitter. So I'm going to call this function input disable X, right? No parameters right now because we're really just focusing on X. And I'm going to create it. And then I'm going to click on it here again just to see what the default property is for it. So that's going to load up here in our formula bar. And then I'm going to set this to display mode .edit as default. Right? That is going to be display mode.edit. That's going to be the default value for that input property. Now I'm going to come down to my X button, and I'm going to come to display mode, and I'm going to change this so that it inherits from that input function. So function properties dot function input disable X. And I'm going to call it like a function, right? And so now what happens is that particular button display mode will inherit from my actual value here. So just to prove, right, if I disable that, we should see that's disabled, right? Now we want to enable by default, so we're going to do that, okay? So now what happens is if I go into the app, right, so I'm going to simulate that by going over to screens here, and I'm going to go find that value on my component. So I've already got the component there, so I was working with it with the output. And if I click on function input disable X and I change that value, right, shows me the default value, I can now change that to disabled. Now I'm within the app, right? I am within the app, and now I'm able to pass that in. So what happens is that I'm just passing this value into the app. Now, no event happened in the app, or excuse me, in the component, right? I absolutely could have had a event happen in the component, would have invoked this particular function as well. But for now, I'm just showing how I could utilize this input function to get some logic dictated by the app. And then the logic in that app is also being used within the component to do some disabling of that. So you can allow that. So maybe, for example, I change this to be a little bit more dynamic and at a later time, right? But again, we're in the same boat now that we were before. I've got a single input property that has to be attached to each one of these buttons. Not the best or the most dynamic. So let's come back over in our component, and we're going to build another input property. So I'm going to change this to function, leave it as input, and again, we're going to name this a little bit more dynamically. So I'm going to say function input disable dynamic. All right, we'll leave that as it is. And then I'm going to set up a new parameter, and we'll set the parameter up to be social network name, again, like that, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to pass in to this function from, or we're going to use the function from the app side to identify exactly which of these should be disabled, right? Okay, so I'm going to hit create, and I'm going to hit create, and I'm going to go into my disable dynamic value, and I'm going to change it from its default value of text, right? We're going to change that also to display mode dot edit. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to come over to each of these buttons. We only affected the Twitter one at first, but we're going to come over here, and I am going to say function properties, and I'm going to call the dynamic one now, right? Because I don't need that guy. That's just hard coded. So I'm going to hit dynamic, and I'm going to open it up, and it says, hey, you've got to pass in a parameter. And so I'm going to say X. Right? Okay, so now what should happen is I want to copy this over. I want to copy this over for each of these additional buttons, but on each button inside of that particular value, inside the display mode value, I'm going to change it to its particular social network, linked in, right? And I'm going to do the same thing, go over to display mode for blue sky, and I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to pass blue sky. Okay, so again, what are we doing here? What's going on? Well, I've created a component property, input property, disable dynamic, and I've associated it, tying it to the display mode of my buttons here. Okay, so now what happens is I can come over into my screen, and when I go to that function, I can define the logic, right? And I can define the logic based on the parameter. So I'm going to come over there, and instead of just saying display mode.edit, if I said display mode.disabled, every single one of them gets disabled, right? But what I'm going to do is I'll expand this a little bit. I'm going to replace it with some logic. It says if social network name, right? So now I'm able to access that parameter, social network name, that was part of my input property, right? It's a parameter, equals X, disabled, else, edit, right? Simple logic, simple expression. So now if I change this to LinkedIn, well, LinkedIn. If I change it to blue sky, great, right? Okay, cool. Well, but what if we want to get a little bit more dynamic, right? Well, I could say X, comma, blue sky. That doesn't work, but if I change the equal to N, Now I'm saying, well, if the social network is in any of these, either of these options, disable it. Otherwise, edit it. So LinkedIn isn't in there, stays editable, clickable. Edit X and Blue Sky are not, right? So a pretty cool way. Now you could come in here and say, you know what, if it's Saturday or Sunday, I want my employees to really be able to spend their weekends enjoying themselves. So, disable them on the weekend or something like that. So super powerful. What this does is highlights the power of both the output and the input, how you can define the logic on the app side for the input. You can invoke the logic on the output within the component, and you could also use them together. Okay, so one final note about these functions is, remember, they can't really access behavior properties. They can't access variables or create variables. So if I were to go back into my component and just choose one of these, I'll click on the function properties and I'll just do output, right? So let me just open up LI social. That was a simple one. And I were to come in here and try to replace this with set var name. This is a variable. We see it doesn't work. It's getting the error. And when I hover over it, it just says behavior function and a non-behavior property. Can't use this property to change values elsewhere in the app. So not able to do that, right? Can't actually invoke that. If I were to come down to my button and did select button to share LinkedIn, right? Did that. Doesn't like that either, right? So again, just simple logic is what can go inside of these. So keep that in mind. Now, what are the key takeaways? Well, function properties process logic inside the component, right? That's whether it's output or input. And so they'll return the values dynamically to each other. And they don't trigger actions, just like we saw. Can't invoke a select, can't create a variable. But where you can do that is action properties. So be on the lookout for my other video on action properties, enhanced properties, action properties.